Hi, I'm Mark Sleboda, and this is The Real Politick. As the conflict in Ukraine enters its 9th month, everyone agrees that it has become largely a grinding war of attrition and logistics in East Ukraine, reminiscent of World War I and the predominance of the return of artillery, the proverbial king of the battlefield, as well as fortifications and trench warfare, in defining this battlefield. It is a true maxim in military affairs that amateurs talk strategy, but professionals study logistics. Eventual victory in this conflict, whatever that looks like, may come down to brute military industrial capacity to produce such basic, unfashionable or sexy old-tech supplies like artillery shells. In line with its stated intervention goal of demilitarization, Russian airstrikes have, for months now, battered and crippled the Kiev regime's military industry. Back in June, Kiev regime officials had already decried that their own stocks of 152mm artillery shells, and just about everything else, were exhausted or destroyed. They are unable to produce more, and they are completely reliant on Western supplies. They depend completely on the supply of Western artillery and NATO standard 155mm and 105mm shells for them. Vadim Skibitsky, the deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence, told The Guardian, "This is an artillery war now. The front lines are now where the future will be decided, and we are losing in terms of artillery. Everything now depends on what the West gives us. Ukraine has one artillery piece to 10 to 15 Russian artillery pieces. The Kiev regime's forces are using 5,000 to 6,000 artillery rounds a day, while Russian forces are firing up to 60,000. For those keeping count, that's more than a 10 to 1 artillery advantage to Russia in what everyone agrees is an artillery war. Now we learn that the West itself is almost out of artillery shells and other useful military weapons to give to the Kiev regime. A Pentagon official told CNN that the stockpiles of certain systems are dwindling after nearly 9 months of sending supplies to Kiev during the high-intensity war, as there's a finite amount of excess stocks which the U.S. has available to send. The U.S. military and the military-industrial complex are simply not geared up for this kind of industrial, old-fashioned war. For decades, they've been orientated towards high-tech boondoggles and for counterinsurgency warfare, and have not manufactured the quantities of basic ammunition needed to sustain an enduring high-intensity land conflict with a near-peer adversary in Europe. Frederick Kagan, a neocon senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, told Foreign Policy magazine that NATO doesn't really plan to fight wars like this. And by that I mean wars with a super intensive use of artillery systems and lots of tank and gun rounds. We were never stocked for this kind of war to begin with. In the U.S., the current total production rate for 155mm artillery shells is about 30,000 rounds per year. That is only 5 days' supply for the Ukraine regime at the current firing rates, or not even half a day's worth for Russia, in a whole year of U.S. production. And hesitant U.S. defense companies have said it would take years to retool and ramp up their production, even if they could be assured of long-term profitable contracts for such items, which they cannot. Military-industrial production lines can't just be turned on and off at will. There is no wartime economy. So the so-called arsenal of democracy is proving rather bankrupt where it now counts. The Biden admin has gotten so desperate that they are trying to seal a deal with South Korea on the other side of the world to supply 100,000 155 millimeter artillery shells for the Kiev regime. Now that's not even 20 days supply. And when that's gone, where will they scrape more from after that? European NATO countries have also exhausted their own stocks and can't even backfill them for their own militaries to replace what they have already sent to the Kiev regime in Ukraine. Similarly, the US has promised the Kiev regime another 18 HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems to replace those that Russia has destroyed. On contract, with a backlog. They'll get them in a few years after they are built. This is why the monthly military aid package from the US to the Kiev regime has been steadily decreasing in terms of both quality and quantity. The collective West can't even keep up with what the Kiev regime is currently spending or Russia is destroying. It's so bad that NATO officials are now meeting and worriedly discussing how to support members if their own stockpiles fall below the levels needed just to meet their minimum defense obligations under the North Atlantic Treaty. Meanwhile, despite tidal waves of wishful thinking and disinfo stories in the Western mainstream media about Russia running out of this and that from the beginning of the conflict, almost none of it has been proven true. If BS fake news production rate won conflicts, the West would win, hands down. Meanwhile, despite this, the Russian missiles keep flying and the shells keep falling. The truth is that Russia has immense Soviet stockpiles of artillery shells and rockets to draw on. And since the Cold War, an old-school military-industrial complex geared to fight exactly this kind of land-centric artillery-heavy industrial-scale war in Europe. This is Russia's game they are playing. With all indications that the Kremlin is settling in for a long conflict, the logistics math simply does not look good for NATO or their Kiev client regime. Russia grinds slowly on, demilitarizing not just the Kiev regime in Ukraine, but now NATO as well.